Stage 1. They find out you were there. You were doing something completely ordinary, grabbing lunch to deli 2 blocks from your office, sitting in your car in a parking garage waiting for a friend who was running late, walking through a neighborhood you cut through every day without thinking about it. You weren't looking for anything. You weren't paying close attention. You were just a person moving through a Tuesday, the way you move through every Tuesday, with nothing on your mind beyond what you were going to eat and whether you remembered to reply to that email. Then something happened. Maybe it was fast, maybe it played out over several minutes, but there was a moment where your brain registered that what you were seeing was not normal, not Tuesday normal, a confrontation that went too quiet, too fast. A man in an expensive suit handing something to a man who had no business being in the same sentence as expensive suits. A car that pulled up and then left, and then the person on the sidewalk just wasn't there anymore. You don't fully understand what you saw, not in any way you could articulate cleanly to another person, but some part of your nervous system filed it away as wrong. You went home. You probably told yourself it was nothing. People tell themselves that constantly, and most of the time they're right, and nothing ever comes of it, and the strange thing they half saw fades into the texture of forgotten days. You might have been one of those people, except that a federal agent reviewing surveillance footage from a camera mounted above a parking garage entrance has already paused on your face, already written down the partial plate on your car, already sent a request to the DMV. They know you exist before you know they're looking. That's how it always starts. Not with a dramatic knock at the door. It starts with a name on a list, a note in a file, someone who was there and who might have seen something and who needs to be contacted. You're still at home making dinner. You don't feel the file being opened. You don't feel the investigation beginning to reach in your direction. You just feel like yourself, in your kitchen, on your Tuesday, completely unaware that your life is about to get significantly more complicated. Stage 2. The knock. They come on a Wednesday morning, which somehow makes it worse. Wednesday is the most ordinary day of the week. Nothing dramatic is supposed to happen on a Wednesday. You open the door and there are 2 of them, both in clothes that are professional without being flashy, both holding credentials that they show you in the practiced way of people who have done this hundreds of times. They introduce themselves. They say they're with the federal government. They say they have a few questions. They say you're not in any trouble. All 3 of those things contain some version of the truth, and none of them are the complete truth. You're not in trouble in the sense that you haven't done anything wrong, but trouble and safety are not the only 2 options available. There's a wide middle territory where people end up who simply happen to be somewhere at the wrong time, and you are standing at the entrance to that territory right now in your doorway on a Wednesday morning.
You let them in because you don't know what else to do, and because refusing feels like it means something it probably doesn't, but you can't be sure. They sit on your couch. They decline coffee. One of them does most of the talking. The other one watches you, not in a threatening way, just in the way of someone whose job it is to notice things. They ask about the day, the specific day. They want to know where you were, what time, what you saw, who else was around. You answer carefully, because instinct tells you to be careful, and instinct isn't wrong here, but careful comes out as vague. And vague is something they've been trained to move around. They ask the same question 3 different ways without it feeling repetitive. They let silences open up between questions, and you fill them the way people always fill silences, with details you hadn't planned to offer. By the time they leave, they have more than you intended to give them. They hand you a card. They tell you to call if you remember anything else. At the door, almost as an afterthought, one of them mentions they may need to follow up. You say, of course. You close the door and stand in your hallway for a long moment. The apartment feels different than it did an hour ago. Not dramatically different, just slightly shifted, like a piece of furniture moved 2 inches while you weren't looking. Stage 3. The weight of it. They follow up. Of course they follow up. The call comes 4 days later, and then there's another meeting. This time at a federal building downtown, which is a different experience than them sitting on your couch. Federal buildings have a particular quality to them. The lobbies are too large. The security is thorough in a way that makes you feel both safe and slightly suspected at the same time. You go through a metal detector, and someone signs you in, and someone else walks you to a room that has a table and chairs and a window that looks out at the side of another building. Now there are 3 of them. One is introduced as being from the prosecutor's office. Prosecutor means charges. Charges mean a case that has already moved beyond preliminary. Whatever you witnessed wasn't the beginning of something. It was the middle of something that had already been running for a while, and you walked into the frame without knowing the film was rolling. They're more direct this time. They want specifics.
Times, positions, distances, descriptions. They want to know what you heard as well as what you saw. They want to know if you have a phone and whether you took any photos or video. You didn't. They want to know if you told anyone. You mentioned it to your partner that night, just in passing as a strange thing that happened. They want your partner's name. You give it. Somewhere in the middle of the third meeting, you start piecing things together from the questions themselves. The questions have a shape. They're oriented around specific things, specific people, specific moments in a timeline you're only seeing fragments of. You ask one of the agents directly what this is about. He pauses. He looks at the person from the prosecutor's office. Something passes between them that you're not supposed to read, but you read anyway. Then he tells you enough. Not everything, but enough. You drive home and sit in the parking garage of your building for 11 minutes before going inside. Not because you're panicking, just because you need 11 minutes in a quiet enclosed space to let the shape of things settle into something you can actually hold in your mind. The thing you saw was not a minor thing. The people involved are not minor people. The case that has been quietly building involves money and power, and at least one person who has spent significant resources trying to make sure that whatever happened on that Tuesday stays in the dark. And you were there, and now they know you were there. And now there's no version of this where you just go back to being a person who doesn't know what you know.
Stage 4. The question nobody wants to be asked. They ask if you'd be willing to testify. They don't lead with it. They spend a meeting building toward it, establishing context, explaining the importance of the case in terms that are measured and careful, and then they ask it, and the room gets very quiet in a way that makes the question feel larger than the words it's made of. Willing, that's the word they use. They frame it as a choice because legally it is a choice, but the frame is doing a lot of work. They explain that your account is significant, that the physical evidence is strong, but the testimony from a credible witness who is present changes the nature of what the prosecution can build. They explain that without witnesses, cases that should succeed sometimes don't. They do not use the word willing again, but it's still in the room. You ask what happens if you say no. The person from the prosecutor's office explains, in a tone that is genuinely not threatening, but genuinely not soft either, that witnesses who have material information in a federal case can be compelled to testify, that a subpoena is a legal document with legal consequences, that refusing to comply is its own separate legal problem. You nod. You ask what happens if you say yes. They explain witness preparation, the process of getting you ready for a courtroom, the steps they take to present witnesses in ways that minimize complication. Minimize complication. Not minimize risk, complication. You notice the word choice. You understand that word choice at moments like this is not accidental. Minimizing complication implies there is complication that cannot be fully minimized. It implies that saying yes has a shape to it that saying no does not. You think about it for 3 days. You think about it in the morning before you get up, and at night when you can't sleep, and in the middle of conversations at work where you're physically present, but not really there. You think about what you saw and what it means and who it involves and what it would mean for those people to walk away from it untouched. You think about the kind of person you understood yourself to be before any of this happened and whether that person could look at a situation like this and choose the easier path without losing something that doesn't have a simple name. You call the agent on the 3rd day. You tell him yes. He says good. He says they'll be in touch about next steps. The call is shorter than you expected, and somehow that makes it feel more serious, not less. You've agreed to step into something that is now going to move on its own timeline, in its own direction, with or without your comfort. Stage 5, preparation. The federal prosecutor assigned to your preparation is someone who has done this many times and whose entire manner communicates that fact. She is not unkind. She is thorough in a way that initially feels excessive and eventually feels necessary. The first session lasts 4 hours. The second lasts 5. By the third, you've told the story of what you saw so many times in so many different ways that you started to notice the parts that feel uncertain and the parts that feel absolutely solid, and the distance between those two categories. She pushes on the uncertain parts, not to undermine you, but because the defense attorney is going to push on them much harder in a room full of people, and she needs to know exactly how you hold up. She asks the same questions 6 different ways. She comes at details from unexpected angles. She asks you to describe the same moment starting from different points in time. She asks what you didn't see as carefully as she asks what you did. She is building a version of your testimony that is airtight, not because it has been shaped into something different from the truth, but because the truth has been thoroughly examined and every soft edge has been identified and addressed. You learn things about how courtrooms work that you never wanted to know, how to address the judge,
How to answer only the question that was actually asked and not the question you thought was being asked. How to pause before answering to give yourself a moment to be certain. How to say, "I don't know," or "I don't remember," when those are the accurate answers, because those answers are stronger than uncertain guesses that a defense attorney can dismantle in front of a jury. They bring up your security in a way that is deliberate about not being alarming. They say the precautions are standard. They say that for the vast majority of witnesses in cases of this nature, the process concludes without incident. Vast majority is doing the same work that minimize complication did in the earlier meeting. You notice it. You don't push on it because you don't want the answer that pushing would produce. But you notice it. And that night, you check the locks on your doors in a way you haven't since you were new to the city and nervous about everything. Your partner asks how you're doing with all of it. You say fine, then you say, "I don't know." And then you talk for a long time about what it's like to be inside a process this large when you entered it by accident, when you didn't raise your hand and volunteer, when you just happened to be somewhere on a day that turned out to matter. Your partner listens, doesn't try to fix it or reframe it, just listens. That night, you sleep better than you have in weeks. Stage 6. The courtroom. Federal courtrooms are quieter than you expect. You've seen courtrooms in film and television, and they tend to be charged and dramatic and full of noise. This room is none of those things. It's large, and the ceilings are high, and the wood is dark, and there is a specific quality of seriousness built into the architecture itself, the way certain spaces communicate their own weight without anyone having to say a word. You sit in a waiting area outside with bad coffee and a victim witness coordinator who checks on you every 20 minutes with the same steady, unhurried expression. The waiting is its own particular experience. You've prepared. You know what you're going to say. You've said it dozens of times in various rooms with various people watching, but waiting strips away the sense that you're ready and replaces it with something raw. You think about the thing you saw on that Tuesday, how ordinary it appeared on the surface before you understood what it was. You think about all the Tuesdays before it and all the Tuesdays after, and how thin the line is between a life that intersects with something like this and a life that doesn't. They call your name. You walk into the room, and the first thing you feel is the number of eyes. The jury, the gallery, the attorneys at their tables, the judge elevated at the front, and at the defense table, in a suit that fits well and an expression that reveals nothing, the person whose actions on a Tuesday you didn't choose are the reason you're standing here. You look at them for just a moment. They look ordinary. That's the thing nobody tells you. How ordinary the people at the center of very serious things so often look. The oath, the chair. The prosecutor leads you through your account the way she rehearsed it with you, gently and in the right order, and your voice is steadier than you expected. You tell the truth, the whole, clean, unedited version of what you saw. The distance and the light and the people and the sequence of events. You feel the jury watching you the way you watch someone when you're trying to decide whether to believe them. You look at them when you answer. You speak clearly. You don't perform. The defense attorney crosses. He's skilled, and he's careful, and he finds 2 small points of uncertainty in the peripheral details and works them with the patience of someone who knows that one thread is sometimes enough to unravel the confidence of a jury. You stay calm, you correct what needs correcting, and hold firm on what is solid. And you say, "I'm not certain about that," when you aren't, which takes the thread away from him before he can pull it. You step down. You walk out. The victim witness coordinator is in the hallway with a bottle of water, and you take it, and your hands are shaking in a way you didn't feel while you were in the room. You stand there for a moment. The courtroom doors are closed behind you. Inside, the trial continues. Your part in it is finished. Whatever happens next happens without you, and it will happen the way it happens. And you have done the thing you came to do, and now you wait. The verdict comes 18 days later. Guilty. Multiple counts. The prosecutor calls you personally to tell you, and there's something in her voice beyond professional satisfaction. You expect to feel something clean and resolved. What you feel instead is complicated. There's relief, yes, but there's also a strange flatness. You've spent months inside the weight of this thing, and now it's over, and your life is right there waiting. And it looks almost exactly the same as before, and somehow that's the strangest part of all. You go back to work. You go back to your routines. People who know what you went through ask how you're doing, and you say fine, because fine is the easiest answer and also partly true. You don't talk about it much, not because you're hiding from it, but because it doesn't translate well. The specific texture of that experience, of being an ordinary person accidentally threaded into a federal case, of sitting in a waiting room with bad coffee while a verdict gets decided that you helped make possible, doesn't fit neatly into conversation over lunch. There are nights when you think about it, not obsessively, but the way you think about any significant thing that happened to you. The knock on your door on a Wednesday morning, the two agents with their careful politeness, the courtroom and the high ceilings, and the ordinary face of someone who did very serious things. The way your hand shook around that water bottle in the hallway. You didn't plan any of this. You were just in the wrong place at the wrong time, doing something completely ordinary on a Tuesday that turned out not to be ordinary at all. But somewhere in the middle of all of it, you made a choice to step towards something difficult instead of away from it. You didn't have to. Some people don't. But you did. And that part, the choosing part, that's something that doesn't dissolve into the background the way that first Tuesday almost did. It stays with you, quietly, as part of the texture of who you are now, in a life that looks almost the same as before, but isn't quite, and never fully will be again.